Hi, everybody. I'm Sunny, and this is We Gotta Talk, a live weekly digital talk show and podcast where we like to dig deep. Real talk, big topics. Now, let's dig in. Hi, everybody, and welcome to We Gotta Talk. I am really glad you're with us today. We are digging into a topic today that I think a lot of people are scared to address: grief. Grief is something that we all experience, whether it's in a more dramatic form, like losing a loved one at an early point in our lives, or even losing a relationship or seeing a relationship change over time. And today's guest is here to talk about it all. And I'm so grateful. Krista St. Germain is a life coach. She's the host of the Widowed Mom podcast, and she has used her own personal story of grief to help people move through that stage in their life with a sense of power, empowerment, and a look toward the future at growth, which I think for anyone who's experienced grief might be the most important part of the process, something to look forward to. Krista, thank you so much for joining me today on We Gotta Talk.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me, Sunny. It's always a pleasure to talk about grief.
Yeah, we were joking before the podcast started, and we said, let's make this digestible and good. But you said something so profound, which is like, I actually like talking about this. I wish more people like talking about this, Krista, because it happens to all of us, and I don't know why we're so uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, and the more we talk about it now, the more prepared we are when it actually happens the next time, which is what I definitely wasn't. So yeah.
Yeah, let's lead with that. Tell us your story. Tell us how you got into the line of work that you're doing now.
A little bit by accident, no pun intended, but I was 40 and I was on my second marriage. My first one had kind of gone down in flames, and I had met like the man of my dreams, right? It was like the true redemption story of, you can find someone who values you and will treat you well, and you can have an amazing life together. And we were on our way back from a trip, and we had driven separately, and I had a flat tire, pulled over on the side of the interstate. Stubborn man that he was, did not want to wait for AAA to come and change that tire. Baby, just let me change the tire. I'll do it. We'll get home faster. So I'm standing on the side of the road, texting my then 12-year-old daughter to tell her we would be late. And he's digging in my trunk, trying to get access to the spare tire and a car, which we later found out the driver had both meth and alcohol in his system. 5:30 on a Sunday. So it's still daylight. Did not see our hazard lights, did not brake, just crashed right into the back of Hugo's Durango and trapped him in between his car and my car. And what felt like this perfect, amazing life and amazing future was just within 24 hours, like ripped away. And so I didn't really know anything about grief at that point, right? And most of what I did know really was kind of outdated and not so useful. So once I got through that, and kind of came up for air and found tools that actually work, and I had to search for them, I decided I don't want other people to have this experience that I had and not be informed and not understand grief and struggle so much. And so I just decided, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a coach, and I'm going to help people with this. And so that was 2016, and here we are.
My God, Krista, you not only experienced grief, but you were there at the moment your husband passed. I mean, to say that's like, I have sympathy for you is like an understatement of the year. I mean, how did you recall even physically removing yourself from that scene? I mean, and is it true that when you experience an acute point of trauma like that you sometimes lose memory or lose a sense of presence in the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for every person. For me, it was oddly calm. I just remember thinking, okay, because I wasn't looking when the accident happened. I just heard the impact of it. And then I turned around and I couldn't see him. And I saw the driver of the other car get out and stumble. And as I look back on it, I remember how clear I felt in the moment that the first thing I need to do is call for help, right? It was like everything slowed down. And I know that was not how I was experiencing it at all. But for me, it was oddly in slow motion. And there are elements of it that I don't remember. And, fast forward to the hospital and a large debacle there, things did not go well, an hour of watching them do CPR. And I mean, trauma with a capital T. And really hard for me to imagine in those early days how it could ever be possible for me to really love life again. It really did feel, especially, in the early aftermath, that I had my chance at happiness and it was never coming back. Like that was it.
Tell me about the mix of emotions there. You just described one, which sounds like a sense of hopelessness,
Mhm.
anger, because what I'm hearing you
Mhm.
describe is a person who was deliberately out of
Mhm.
control, who had chosen to take substances that
Mhm.
would impact his
Yeah.
ability to function. I would have raging
Mhm.
anger, Krista, and I'm sure you did too. Or did you not?
It's strange though. And I mean, I don't believe that any emotions are problems, certainly not anger. I come to you with a completely open heart about all emotions, but for me, anger was not a predominant emotion. I was
Mm,
angry that it happened, and I was brokenhearted that it happened. But I think it was quick for me to come to the conclusion that you don't end up with meth and alcohol in your system at 5:30 on a Sunday if your life is going well, right? Like
right.
you're not loving life if that's what's happening to you. And so I just never really believed that, even though I wanted that person to be held accountable, I never really believed that he did that on purpose. And the same thing with the doctors, because there was some procedural issues that, who's to say what actually
Mm,
caused the death ultimately. It just doesn't even matter. But at one point, after they couldn't bring him back when he had coded, a doctor came in, and the main doctor, and really apologized and said, something went wrong and we tried. And he was just devastated. I mean, he was just like crying right in front of me, and just, I'm so sorry this happened. And I remember my stepmother was in the room, that little ICU room where you
right.
you wait, right? And she was like, so basically what you're saying is that you killed him. And she was just, I mean,
Livid.
rage. Yeah. Controlled rage, but you could tell seething. And that just wasn't what felt true to me in that moment. What felt true to me in that moment was, this is a man who tried really hard and something went wrong. And he
Right.
did the best job he could with what he knew. And he was devastated and about to go and try and take care of another patient, right, who also needed his attention. So, yeah, anger, just for me, it wasn't a huge part of my grief. But it's totally okay and common when it is. It just wasn't for
Yeah,
me.
it almost sounds like there's no space left sometimes for anger in that immense amount of maybe mourning you were feeling too. That it's the acceptance of this is what happened, and for you to have accepted that in the moment, I think speaks volumes about. I mean, the type of person you are, because I think a lot of people might get stuck in that who's to blame game, and that's really in your work, and especially dealing with widows and widowers and people who've
Mm-hmm.
experienced grief. Do you encounter most people getting stuck? And I don't want to use the word that stage of grief, because I know that there are some issues with the process
Yeah,
of
yeah.
whatever the number of steps of grief that you were going to discuss a little bit later. But do you find most people do get stuck in that moment?
I see it as almost more like a protective thing. Sometimes they get stuck, but when you break it down, what I usually find is, if we kind of take all of the emotions that humans experience and we stack them in order from the least desirable to the most desirable, powerlessness, despair, fear, those are some of the lower level emotions, the ones that humans really don't like.
Hmm.
And so while we don't like anger, it's actually higher on the emotional scale. It's a more powerful feeling than powerlessness. So a lot of what I see is that our brain will take us to a place of anger almost as a way to avoid powerlessness.
Wow, that's profound.
Yeah. And yeah, and it can be really useful to know, oh, because we tend to judge ourselves for being angry or beat ourselves up or tell ourselves there's something wrong because we're so angry. And sometimes if we can step back and go, wait, I think this is actually the part where my brain's kind of trying to keep me safe, trying to keep me away
Mm.
from what I really don't want, which is to acknowledge that I am powerless and feel that.
I have to ask you if this impacted your faith at all. I mean, to go through, and I don't know
Yeah.
how faithful of a person or to what traditions you ascribed or back then or do now, but how did it change your view on fate and faith?
Yeah, it really does impact people so much. So for me, it was interesting. My husband didn't have any faith at all. He was an atheist. He was an engineer, a scientist, like, that was just not a part of his life. And when we got married, I actually had my pastor marry us, even though it wasn't his church, but he was totally willing to do that. And so I was a member of the Unity Church. And for me, it just felt like it didn't impact that much. It is, how I see it is that, we're all part of one mind, one source, one love, one energy, right? And suffering is caused when we think life is going to go one way and it goes another, right? And that's what the human mind does, is we have this idea of the way that it's supposed to go. But that isn't necessarily the way it's going to go. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was more of a coming home to, okay, actually, I don't know. I thought I knew, but actually I don't know. And there's kind of peace for me, and there was, in surrendering back to that truth, that it's okay for me not to know. And it's okay for me to wish, right? And have wanted it to be what it wasn't.
Yeah.
Right.
And those can coexist, right? Your
those can
desire
totally coexist. Right. Yes. So I never felt like I was being punished or, but I didn't grow up in, in the belief that good things happen to good people. Right. That was never really, and a lot of people do, right? A lot of people.
Right. I was going to say, you're not Catholic then, are you?
No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not. And so I didn't really have to reconcile with, to me, it was like, no, actually, right, like, bad things happen to good people all the time.
It's so interesting too, because I have, gone through, knock on all the wood, minor phases of grief in my life. I should say grief appropriate for someone of my age at 41 years old. Thankfully did not experience the loss of a parent early or anyone of tremendous significance. I mean, things happened in the quote unquote traditional order up to this point in my life, but I have witnessed so many people have such vastly different reactions to grief and death, from something you're talking about, a calm sort of acceptance and a desire to move on, to sort of raging against the whole experience and really fighting the change. And I wonder if you ever advise the people that you work with, and I know you work in the capacity of a life coach in addition to hosting your podcast, is that part, does it have to be part of the healing process, a seeking toward a greater power or faith? And how do you deal with people who go into this experience of grief with such different life experiences and faiths, beliefs to begin with? Because you're probably dealing with people who have all sorts of different belief systems.
Yeah, for sure. I like to think about it with the framework that post-traumatic growth is possible for all of us, right? It's not morally superior. It's not mandatory, but it is possible for all of us. And one component of post-traumatic growth is often spiritual growth or spiritual connection. And so basically what that means is, we can take anything that happens to us in our lives, including something that we experience as traumatic, which is highly subjective, and we can use that to inform the choices that we make. Right. And so if we can do that intentionally, then we can come out on the other side living a life that is even more aligned with what we value, right? That is an even fuller expression of who we want to be. And there can be a spiritual component to that. Right. It's different for every person. So what I'm interested in is helping people understand, okay, what is your experience like right now? And does that align with the experience that you want for yourself? And if it doesn't, what's in the way? Right. And then can we create something that is intentionally what you want it to be? Not because it's right or wrong or good or bad, or there's, a way that you should be doing it, or that it makes you a better person if you do, but because this is your life. Right. And no matter what happens to you, you get to choose.
That's empowering, the concept of choice and otherwise pretty powerless situation. Right. One final question about faith, and then I want to move on. I find it so intrinsically tied to the concept of grief that it's hard for me to not really dwell here for a moment. Did you have any dreams or experiences or supernatural moments, for lack of a better term, after Hugo's passing that made you feel something or other about where people do go when they pass?
Yeah. So a couple of things come to mind. One is that was when I was like mad because I remember saying, okay, come to me in my dreams. Show me that you are okay. Give me some sort of sign. And I could never get anything. I just
Mhm.
remember being like, kind of mad at him for that, just wishing for it, longing for it, waking up and just going, oh, it didn't happen again. I didn't feel it again. But then the moment that most comes to mind is I was in the mountains. My parents have a cabin in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and Hugo loved to go there. It was one of his favorite places to be. And I was sitting in the main living room with my daughter, who at that time, maybe 13, 14. And I was looking at this beautiful view of the valley. And I turned to her and I said, I wish Hugo were here. And she looked at me like I had multiple heads, right? She looked at me and she goes, Mommy, he is here. And I just like, oh, like my whole body. It was just such a powerful realization for me that connection is something we create. I was sitting there experiencing disconnection because I was believing that he wasn't there, that he was somewhere else. And yet my daughter, who's so wise for her age, is sitting there experiencing complete connection with him because it hasn't even occurred to her to believe that he's not there,
Hmm.
right? And what power we have in how we choose to think about where our loved ones are, independent of what might actually be true, right? What we think about, we really do find evidence for. And
Oh, I
she was
love
just
that.
having this connected experience. And then from that moment on, I realized, oh, okay, I get to feel connected to him whenever I want based on how I think.
I love that. How
Yeah.
wise.
I know,
Um,
right? At 14,
that's
she blows me away.
yeah, it's crazy. I mean, kids, I'm telling you, the older we get, the duller we
Yeah.
get with our perception of
Something.
things. There's something so beautiful in the simplicity. You've talked quite a bit about the myth of the grief stages in your
Mm,
work, and
yeah.
this popular concept that there are X number of stages of grief. And it's your belief that this doesn't really apply to losing a loved one. Can you tell us why you're not necessarily in agreement with that theory and why you shouldn't necessarily try to fit your experience into a box?
Yeah, totally. This is, the only grief theory I knew about after Hugo died was the 5 stages. I had never heard of any other grief theory. And whenever I ask people what other grief theories they know about, nobody can answer that question unless they're like me and they do grief work, right? So there are, just like any field of study, there are many theories, there are many ideas. And for some reason, the 5 stages of grief is just the one that caught on. So it's not that it's harmful or bad. It's that it's one of many theories, and I think it's relevant to know that the way that work came to be was originally, a study of hospice patients. It was a study of people who were coming to terms with their own mortality, with the terminal diagnosis. And then
Oh,
that
that's
work on
interesting.
death and dying, right? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler's work on death and dying was then applied to grief
Mhm.
on grief and grieving. So yes, such a valuable conversation that Dr. Ross started. And at the time, nobody was really talking about it. So much value in that early work. And also, we just kind of seem to like think that that's where grief theory stopped. And then we never talk about anybody else's work. And the problem with it is that then if that's our limited experience, then of course, what do? We don't want something to be messy. We want it to be neat and tidy. So then we try and go, okay, well, there's 5 stages and they must be linear. And then I think I have to follow them. And I don't know, did I go through enough denial? Am I angry enough? Should I bargain more? Is this the part where I'm depressed? Have I accepted yet? Right. And we try to fit ourselves in this, what we perceive as a prescriptive, formulaic idea, which was never how that work was intended to be, right? Some people feel angry, some people don't. Acceptance is not like a place that you reach and then poof, you're done, right? There's no end to grief. It was never meant to be follow this process and yea, verily, you shall reach the end of grief.
Mm.
And right, grief doesn't end.
It's
So,
true, and that's the part that sucks the most, though, Krista. We as humans have such a longing for order and
yeah,
you know, um, just a set
yeah.
of rules, right?
We want
I say this all
certainty.
the time. We want certainty. We want to know what is going to happen next, and as someone who's living this every day, like, can you give us some hope that there's happiness in life, even though grief never ends? Because that
Totally.
sounds really
Yeah, right.
difficult.
So here's how I like to think about it. So grief is the natural human response to a perceived loss, right? So we don't want to shame ourselves or make ourselves feel bad for grieving. It's the natural response to a loss and to a connection. And also, because we're not time travelers and we can't go back and undo the loss, we're always going to have a response to it. And so to me, it's becoming intentional in choosing the response that we want to have. How do we want to take that part of our life experience and integrate it into the wholeness of, this life that we're doing? And that doesn't have to be sad or lonely or depressed at all. If anything, we can become more wise and more intentional and more present, right? More focused, more aligned. And still the loss has happened.
You work recognition if you go into your life now. I mean,
Mm.
and assuming everything you said to be true, which it is, that grief doesn't necessarily end, that you now welcome these connections that you feel you're in charge of to
Yeah.
quote unquote be with or reach out to
Yeah.
him in some spiritual way. How does the day look for you when you have that pinprick of grief and you're taken down for a minute? What are the tools
Yeah,
you use to bounce
it's
back?
evolved so much over time. I mean, now it's I don't really find very many challenges because I've worked through so many of them. So now it feels more like I've got a friend who's looking over my shoulder and, and happy memories, and I tell lots of stories, and my kids and I joke. Hugo's first language was French, and so we have lots of jokes about, ways that he would pronounce words or stories that we tell or things like that. And so it just feels like more like a warm and loving presence. It was interesting to start a new relationship and find a new partner and then kind of integrate that. I think I was a little lucky because I have a podcast about grief and he listened to it. So
Wow,
I
there's
know.
fate, Krista.
Right.
What?
Yeah. Well, he didn't discover me in the podcast. We met online, and then, as one does, you do your research, right, to make sure the person's not like a serial killer, at least as best you
Lots of
can
research.
figure out.
Yes.
And so there are a lot of things that, because I had said them on the podcast, I didn't have to re-say them.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important that other people, that you surround yourself with people who will make space for your memories. Right.
Right. Oh, yeah. You don't it
Yeah.
sounds like the last thing you want is to be around someone who doesn't remember the same things. There's so much
100%.
comfort in
Or is not
sharing.
is somehow intimidated by,
Right.
your memories, because especially if you lose a spouse, you didn't choose that,
Right.
right? Which is a little bit different than like my first marriage, which ended in divorce, which I chose. A little bit
Mhm.
different. But beyond the initial, some of the trauma triggers and things that I had to work through, I've kind
Mhm.
of resolved all of those. So it's mostly light and happy now.
That's good. Moving beyond the myth of the 5 stages of grief then, let's talk about the dual process model of grief, that
Yeah.
what that is and how that's been a useful tool for you.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite grief theories. And the reason I like it so much is because it just honors that life is kind of flowy. Sometimes I notice people will get stuck in this idea of either I need to think only about my grief or I need to completely avoid thinking about my grief. They get kind of stuck in this binary that doesn't really serve them. And the reason I love the dual process model is because it teaches that healing is in the back and forth flow of
Mhm.
both. So you kind of divide activities into grief related. So like you're thinking about your loss, you're, dealing with the memories, you're maybe retelling the story, you're, loss related things, feeling the feelings. And then there's this other second bucket of activities that are restorative in nature that have nothing to do with the loss, right? So hobbies and spending time with friends and Netflix binges and doing anything other than grief.
Mhm.
And I know for me in the early days, I was told by people, well-meaning people, just keep busy. Don't think about it.
Right.
Right. And then there were other people who were like, you've got this, work in front of you. And once you do it, you're going to be fine. You're going to come out on the other end. And it was very binary. And so if we can give ourselves the gift of actually planning the activities that aren't related to the loss, giving ourselves permission to do other things, knowing that we're just going to go back and forth, right? Sometimes we're going to think about the loss and sometimes we're going to do the restorative activities. And it's that intentional oscillation that is so healing. And it's just freeing because then it doesn't force you into one camp or the other. And it kind of lets you be a human and heal, which I
Yeah,
love.
because what I'm hearing too, and this is true with anything, it's true with parenting, it's true with relationships. There is no one roadmap. And again, going back to the concept as humans, we just want it to be easy. We just
Yeah.
feel like there's so much on our plates. God, if there were only a roadmap for raising a kid, or if there were only a roadmap for having a perfect marriage, I mean, we'd all be
Yeah.
happy. They tell us the joys in the process, but that can feel very untrue at times of struggle.
Yeah. 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 And if you're constantly telling yourself that whatever you're doing isn't the thing you're supposed to be doing, you're always going to be in misery.
Yeah. Well, let's dive further into this distraction technique.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Well-meaning people often use that as a tool to kind of get your mind off of things. There's nothing more
Mhm.
frustrating to me though, as a deep processor and empath. When people tell me to distract myself, I am like blind with rage. I'm like, but I have to work through it. I need to live in it, and it's just so. But it can be useful. So when you're talking with people you're coaching, I'd be like, what is that magic formula, and what are some like first baby steps someone who is tiptoeing into this dual process can kind of start with to make sure they're doing just the right
Yeah.
amount of distraction and just the right amount of processing?
Yeah. And how I would kind of think about it is like step back and look at how you're spending your time and look for areas that don't feel ideal to you. Right. So I will work with clients who, once their spouse dies, all of a sudden they're eating more than they wanted to eat, which I definitely did, right? Or they're shopping more than they want to shop, or they're drinking more than they want to drink, or maybe they're working more than they want to work. They're creating something that is a kind of coping mechanism gone extreme, and they
Hmm.
don't really know why they're doing it or how to get themselves out of it. And so it's nothing I would be worrying about unless there's something like that going on where you can
Hmm.
tell that there's a pattern that you just don't really like. Again,
Right.
not right, wrong, not good, bad. It's not a moral thing. It's just from the point of view of what you want with your life is, are you spending the time the way that you want to spend it? And then understanding, okay, probably wasn't taught much about emotion. Most of us weren't, right? We were probably not taught how to actually allow feelings. We were taught how to avoid them and how to judge ourselves for having them and how to hide them, right?
Hmm.
But not really how to feel them. And so of course it makes sense then that we end up in this place where when we're faced with emotion that we aren't really prepared to handle, that we would turn to a behavior to distract ourselves
Hmm.
in a way that serves us because we don't have the skill, but also ultimately in a way that doesn't, because it creates some sort of consequence in life that we don't want. And so then the work becomes, okay, how can I learn how to allow whatever feeling this behavior is helping me avoid so that I can see it's really not going to hurt me, right? I
Hmm.
don't need to turn to shopping or food or drinking in excess, right?
Right.
I
Right.
don't need to work so much that when the world gets silent, I can't handle it.
Silence is hard. Silence is hard at the best of days, but you're right. You're
It
right. You
is
have to you have to
tends to
anticipate
be
that, and so that you know how to be still.
right. What is the emotion
Yeah.
that's likely to show up? What where does my brain go when I am still that makes me feel terrible? And what is that about? Right. And
Hmm.
can I get better at allowing myself to process whatever it is that I'm feeling? And also, can I look to my internal narrative to figure out what is the story I'm telling myself that makes that silence so hard, that makes me want to go to a behavior to get away from it?
Yeah, I've talked about this before, and I'm curious what your experience with it is. There are people who have words going through their head, actual internal dialogues. That is not me.
Hmm.
There are people then there are people who just have feelings about
Hmm.
things, which is me.
Hmm.
What I have found, this is not advice from a professional, by the way, but what I have found is the reason that I can be uncomfortable with periods of silence, which I'm not anymore as I get older, is that until I put a word to it, it's just a big feeling. And I'm working on this with
Hmm.
my kids right now too. Like name it. It is
Hmm.
fear of never having someone to go outside and take a walk with again, or it is fear. Like just
Hmm.
putting a word to it has been
Yeah.
so powerful for me. And
Yeah.
again, that's just my own experience. And that's
I
for feelings
I
beyond
add
grief too.
I add 2 more steps to that.
Okay.
Name it, and I call it the now process just 'cause it's easy for me to remember. So you name it, then you open up to it, which is
Mm,
exactly the opposite of what our primitive mind wants us to do, right?
right.
But, like, really truly opening your shoulders and breathing it in and kind of giving it permission to be there. and then witnessing it. That's the W. What actually is it in your body? Right? Where is that emotion in your body being experienced? Is it in your stomach? Is it in your chest? Is it in your throat? Like, where is it? And what is it like? Because emotions are just vibrations, right? It's just energy in the body somewhere. And when we shut down, we close off, we can't actually allow them to flow through. So name it, which is brilliant, right? Open up to it, give it permission to be there, and then watch it as essentially those chemicals make their way through your system, which really only takes about 90 seconds if we're actually in the place of the watcher.
And watching is just
Yeah, like
being
what is
present
it?
with it? Right,
Asking
right.
yourself questions about it, getting really curious about it. If you were going to explain it to a robot who had never experienced a feeling, like what's that guy on Star Trek, Data, right? Like what actually is it? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it buzzy? Is it slow? Is it fast? Does it have a shape? Does it have a texture? What does it have a color? Like what actually is the experience in your body? So
Mm.
that you are diffused a little from the actual experience. You are the being that is having the experience and not the experience itself, right?
Ah,
So
that's
so that
profound.
this is the first thing I teach my clients is how
Oh,
to
that
change their
yeah.
relationship with feelings, because then feelings become less scary and more transitory, and we start to see, oh, there's actually nothing to fear here.
Mhm.
I don't
And
need
fear
to
except fear
distract
itself.
myself, right? I don't need to distract myself from this vibration because it can't hurt me, and if I get curious about it, it's actually really interesting, and maybe there's something I can learn.
I will be using that
Awesome.
method, taking those extra steps there.
Yeah.
Let's talk to the people who are out there dealing with someone who has lost someone. Maybe they haven't recently
Yeah.
personally experienced, but they want to say the right thing. And Krista, is
Mm.
there a right thing to ever say to a grieving person?
We have to just give ourselves so much grace and compassion because no, there really isn't. And oh my gosh, if I look back and I think about all the things I said, the well-intentioned things that I said, I didn't know. I just didn't know. Right. So we have to be kind to ourselves and know that we're doing the best that we can. Um, and we're just not always going to say things in retrospect the way that we wish we should. But it does get easier when we acknowledge or decide to believe that feelings aren't problems,
Hmm.
right? They're not problems to solve. Most of the things that people told me after Hugo died were because they were well intentioned, but because they saw my hurt and they didn't have the capacity to be with me in that hurt, right? They also didn't have the emotional skills. So the answer in our mind, in our well-intentioned mind is I don't know how to feel good when that person feels bad, so what can I say to make them feel better? But when you're in grief, you don't want to feel better. You don't want someone to minimize, he's in a better place. Don't worry. You're young. You'll find someone else. It was always supposed to be this way. Just trust in the plan. Like you're just like, okay, no. What you really want is for someone who can be with you as you feel the way that you feel and not try to fix you because you're not broken.
Hmm. Does
So if
that
we
look
can
like just
change
sitting
that
there? Like sitting with
sometimes.
you? Like what were your most profound and healing moments with people who were trying to help you after Hugo's
Yeah.
passing?
One of my dear coworkers, she said, "I'm gonna go to Barnes& and Noble. Do you wanna come with me?" Right? And she just came and took me out and did not try to change, fix, minimize anything. She just let me talk and just was with me, right? Those kinds of experiences where somebody wanted to be in my presence but could handle me as I was, right? And
Right.
and didn't look for me to be different so that they could feel
Mhm.
better.
Ugh, I'm
Yeah.
telling you, it's the biggest gift you can give a big feeling person in general or someone who is grieving is to just let them be. It is, and it's why women go crazy when men usually say to them, calm down. You're just like,
Mhm.
no, like
Roar!
you just, yes. The worst thing you can do is
Yeah.
just try to compel someone to put it back in the box, at least for
Yeah.
me. But,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
that
totally.
just is,
I also really appreciated it when people just did things for me because everybody says, "Well,
right.
let me know if you need anything." But, you don't always know what you
Right.
need when you're the griever, and sometimes you're really worried about what other people think of you or you don't wanna put
Mhm.
them out, and so when people just jumped in and did stuff, like one of my friends just jumped in and bought school supplies for my kids because school is about to start. She didn't even ask. She just got
Right.
the school supply list and she just did it, right? Little things like that. As some guys came over and they just mowed my lawn every few weeks, or every week for a few weeks, you know?
Right, right. That's
Yeah.
huge. What about kids? I mean, kids are often
Mm.
witness to this grief if they're not experiencing it themselves in their immediate circle. They're part of the families who are coming over to help. So, give us
Mhm.
some guideposts for not only families with kids who are experiencing grief directly, but also talking about grief in
Yeah.
concept to our own children.
Yeah. Yeah. So being using words that are not ambiguous
Mm.
is one of the biggest things that I would love to see people practice. So meaning when we tell a child someone got sick and didn't make it. Okay. Imagine if you don't understand what that means as a child, then the next time somebody gets sick, what are you going to think? Right? As opposed to, he had cancer, which caused his, this part of his body to stop working. And so he died. Do you see the difference? So we want to go, we try to use these vague kind of flowery language because we think it's going to like soften the blow or make it somehow more palatable. When what it actually does is opens their little minds to how it could happen again. And they don't really know, right? Or we're not
Right.
honest with them. And so specific, honest, age appropriate conversations,
Okay,
so
so
much
don't be
more
scared of the
valuable.
detail with kids.
No, and it's
Yeah.
just it's unemotional detail, but it's factual. It's giving them the
Right.
information that they need so that their minds don't fill in the gaps.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, and anyone even outside of the concept of grief raising kids, I think if you don't believe that already comes to that realization, you cannot hide the truth from kids. So you
Mm-mm.
better figure out an age appropriate way to describe just about everything they see and give them that
Yeah,
information because they're going to fill in the blanks with
totally.
whatever it may be if you don't. Okay,
Yeah,
so we've got
100%.
detailed conversations. What about for those who may be witnessing through their parents or someone else close to them sort of grief from like a second degree? It's same kind of concept, so and so's dad
Yes.
died, went to heaven. I mean, like, give us some actual
Well,
practical.
yeah, I don't my views might not be the same as one of your listeners' views, so I don't want to presuppose,
Sure.
heaven or anything, but to the best of your ability, articulate it as clearly and factually as possible.
Okay.
So, so and so's dad got sick and went into the hospital and they tried to help and they were unable to fix his body and so his body stopped working, right? And we're telling explicitly, like specifically what happened. It wasn't that just all of a sudden he didn't feel well and then he went to sleep. Well, that because that's
Right.
terrifying,
Yeah, it's really terrifying. Yes.
right? Because maybe I don't feel well and I might go to sleep. Or what if now someone, that child loves it? What if that happens? That's very scary. So
Right.
we can be more specific. And also
Okay.
not give false assurances. Don't worry, this won't happen to me, right? Don't worry, that won't happen to you. Those things are often we kind of make ourselves feel better by telling a child that in the moment, but that's not really helpful in the long term, right? Right now,
Mhm.
we're safe. I'll do my best job, my best to take care of you. As long as I'm around, I'm going to take care of you. But don't make promises you can't keep.
Mm. Yeah, it's so true. Like I remember being young and my mom, I was clearly a very anxious child too, but really like being introduced to the concept of death fairly early. We were always not always, I don't want to say, but we never avoided funerals as a
Mhm.
family, like great aunts,
Mhm.
great uncles,
Yeah.
anyone that passed, this big Italian family, we all show up. And
Yeah.
not only do we show up, we go up to the casket. You go up, you say a
Mhm.
prayer. I'm like 6 and 7 and I'm witnessing grief and I'm
Yep.
understanding that, which was really valuable. But I do remember coming back from some of those experiences and saying, oh my God, what if it happens to you? And my mom, to her credit, was like, Sonny, that's life. And
Mhm.
I'll be here. It's exactly what you said, which,
Yep.
is really the only answer. And it's difficult for a child to sort of conceptualize. And it really is the last thing you want to tell your own child is there
Yeah.
is possibility that I walk out that door and don't come back. But
Mhm.
like you said, the alternative is much more difficult to bear because you pay the price down the line when something
Yeah.
actually does happen.
Yeah,
So
and so
it's
and your
just,
child does too, right? Yeah, not
yes,
necessary.
awful, awful. Okay, tell us. I just want to get into some couple more finer points
Mhm.
before we wrap things up here. You had this really really interesting point emailing back and forth about how patriarchy shows up in grief, and I want to touch on this too, especially coming from the perspective of a woman experiencing grief. Tell us about this
Yeah.
theory and what's behind it.
Yeah, so, the women that I work with, widowed moms, um, I tend to see this more than maybe other grief workers might because of who I'm helping. But many of us are socialized to believe that what is ideal for us is to find a person, right? Become a mother, become a wife. And our identity is really wrapped up in that. And because we've always thought that, the happiest day of your life is the day you get married, right? And the most important thing for you is to be a mom, and a good one at that. Then when the perfect relationship we thought we had gets taken away from us, and this is
Mm,
independent of what our brain is doing, which is a whole nother deal, right? In terms of how it encodes we and how it's got to relearn and create its own identity again. But it can be really hard for a woman to imagine herself as happy and whole when she's been socialized to believe that her value comes from being in a relationship, right? And being a partner and being a mother. And
mm.
even just, you know, I'm going to be in a room. Do I wear my wedding ring? What will they think if I don't wear my wedding ring? Does that mean I didn't love them enough? Does that mean I'm a bad wife? Right? All of this drama that happens in our brain that most people don't even know happens. And then they feel less than because they're no longer in a partnered relationship. Now we're inclined to jump back in to try to find another partnered relationship because we don't see ourselves as whole without being in one. It's just a whole cluster of thanks patriarchy.
I know, right? You don't realize how screwed you
Well,
are until you realize it, and you're like, "Wow, I've been
but it's
socialized in some really interesting ways as a woman."
Yeah, and conversely, it's also a brilliant opportunity to then look at that and go, "Wow, I really did
Right.
believe that without another person, there's a missing piece. What would it be like to believe that in and of myself, I am whole and completely lovable and worthy, and there is no actual, change in my worth that happens when I am in a partnered relationship, or like productivity, like all the things that we're conditioned to
Mhm.
believe tend to show up when we're trying to refigure it out.
So, like, not to play too much into the Disney narrative of like happily ever after of it all, but you seem to have found happiness beyond grief. And I don't want to promise anyone that
Yeah.
there's always the same outcome at the end of the tunnel,
Mhm.
but tell me when you found happiness and when
I
you
didn't
found
find
it
it.
was you didn't find it. And
I created
you
it.
oh, that's okay. So what
Right?
did it look like? And at what point were you emotionally when you felt whole enough to accept that?
Yes. 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 When I figured out that it's so cliche, but it is so true that happiness is an inside job. It is not something caused by the circumstances of our lives. It is
Mm,
caused by how we think about ourselves in our lives. It is something we create wherever we are, wherever we go. And anything that says we are less than or don't have what we need or aren't whole is just a lie. Right? So it's coming back to what you can control, which is how you think about yourself in your life, which is what
mm,
creates your emotional experience of it, and fully owning that. And so I didn't even personally, not that it's right or wrong, but I personally didn't even date until I was about 3 years into it because
mm.
I, I honestly I didn't want to for quite a while. The idea was a total turn off to me. It felt like a lot of work, but I really wanted to get to a place where I loved my life
Yeah.
exactly as it was. And it wasn't because I was depending on someone else to give me something or believe in me or give me love. It was because I was giving it to myself and I was feeling really good. And then deciding to date again became more about new experiences I wanted to have and love I had that I wanted to give. And it didn't feel like the missing piece, right, that I was trying to find because I figured out there wasn't a missing piece. That was just an illusion.
Ugh, you are knocking me just off my out of my socks today with some of this. There's some conversations I go into, Krista, that I'm like, this will be a benefit to the audience, maybe not, maybe for me at the moment, but this has been such a pleasantly surprising conversation that so many of
I'm
the
so glad.
tools that you talk about, yes, are applicable at every stage in our lives, and that we will
Yeah.
all have a need for the work you do at some point in our lives, and we have had. But wow, like, yeah, I mean, I'm really, really grateful that a lot of these things you're talking about seem to be able to be applied to so many
Yeah.
stages of our life,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
always up and down.
Yeah. I hear
So,
that a lot too from listeners of the podcast that aren't even widows or moms. They're just like, I just really like the information and the way it's making me
yes.
think.
I mean, to be honest, even grieving the change in a relationship or the loss of a friendship or the loss of a relationship with a loved one. I mean, grief
Yeah.
is a universal experience. And we
Yeah.
tend, as we just discussed, to really paint things in black and white terms. We've only experienced grief if you've lost a parent or a spouse. It's really not. I mean, we feel the loss of something at many points in our lives.
Yeah.
So this is
Absolutely.
so helpful in every
I'm so
way.
glad.
Gosh. Yes. Krista, tell us more about where we can find you, how people can engage with you directly to work with you. As we said at the beginning of the
Sure.
podcast, you're a coach, so you do work directly with some clients. Are you taking on new people? And how do we connect with you to hear more?
Yes. Yes. So the Widowed Mom podcast is my podcast. So everyone is welcome to come and listen to that. Don't need to be a widow or a mom to listen and benefit and learn more about grief and post-traumatic growth and all of the things that I just love helping people with. As far as clients, I only work with widowed moms and I only do that in a group capacity. So I run a group coaching program, which is just for widows. It doesn't matter how old your children are. They can be grown and you can have grandkids. That's fine too. But as long as you identify as a widow and a mom, then that's what I do is help people get past whatever it is that they believe is holding them back from loving life again and really get to that place if they want to where they genuinely do love life again. So and then coachingwithkrista.com is where all the contact information lives, all the socials and everything.
All right. Well, thank you, Krista.
You're so
I'm
welcome.
beyond grateful for your wisdom today. Thank you for coming on
Totally
the
my
show.
pleasure. What a great world we live in that we can help people through technology like this.
So cool. So cool. Thank you again, guys. And
You
thank
bet.
you if you've been watching and listening. Like I just said, there are some things you go into and you're like, well, maybe this doesn't apply to my life right now. But this really, really sort of changed my perspective on how universal this advice is for all of us at various stages in our life. So if you got something out of this, I'm so grateful. If you can take a moment, leave a rating and review, those help tremendously in getting this information out to people who might find it useful or helpful. And frankly, this is a topic that I think a lot of people could relate to. So do that as a favor for me on Apple Podcasts if you haven't already. As always, all of the blog posts with breakdowns of our amazing guests live on the We Gotta Talk blog, which is wegottatalk.com/blog. Thank you guys again for listening and watching. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you next week with more good stuff here on We Gotta Talk.